Okay, friends, well, why don't we get started? So, welcome one and all to session 5 of our study of the women of the Bible. And as we begin, before we introduce, so that the folks online can know who's here and vice versa, let's come together in the spirit of prayer. God, we ask that our time of learning this morning be one that's characterized by as much listening as there is sharing, that we might see something new, perceive your spirit in broadening ways that open our minds and our hearts, not only to these amazing and ancient stories, but to how they're applied to our life today and how we might grow and be changed and moved by their experiences of life and faith. In Christ we pray. Amen. Okay, so let's go around the class and we'll introduce ourselves as loudly and clearly as possible for the sake of those online, and then I'll mention who's here joining us online. Kathleen Edwards.
Harry Edwards, Jay Williams,
Carol Williams,
Paula Pollux,
Connie D. Avery,
Bonnie Magnetti,
Joe Beck,
Jane Wurst,
Teresa Roder, Marcia Port,
Pastor Dan, and then we have Ann Galbraith, Boyce Baldwin, Marilyn Chambliss, Bertie Wiest, and Cecily Dewey, our amazing sign painter. I hope you noticed that. Can't say it enough. So, all right, let's get right into it. Actually, before we get into it, because Jay brought up an interesting question and Jane did too, if we're just kind of getting started, but any kind of like initial comments or thoughts about these particular characters for today? Bonnie's got her hand up. Go ahead.
well, I quote unquote made the mistake of trying to look up and see, well, where is Sheba, the Queen of Sheba? And boy, did I get an explanation.
Yes.
I had no idea of all the different stories that go behind this in the Talmud and the Quran. Is this
In
even?
the Kabbalah, there's
Yeah,
so
is
much.
this even a myth? Did this really
Yeah.
happen? In one place it said that their son was King Nebuchadnezzar. And another place it said somebody else, that they had this child, but maybe they didn't. And I mean, it was just like, oh my gosh, there's so many different.
There's a lot of
versions.
speculative connecting of dots that try to place the Queen of Sheba, because we really don't have a lot of information. But my understanding and what I believe is kind of where, roughly she's from would be Ethiopia, an African kingdom, a powerful African kingdom. And I was wondering if it was really Egypt. It does not appear to be Egypt. It seems to be Ethiopia, which at that time was also a very, very prominent and powerful country within Africa. So we'll sort of go with that. But she is a woman of mystery, to be sure. As is Huldah. How many of you, had ever heard of Huldah before? Maybe if you study the books of Kings, and they are really fascinating stories. But yeah, Huldah is not one. I knew someone named Huldah. And she was older and at my church in Plymouth, but I hadn't made the connection. And then I don't know if you noticed in the reading of the Queen of Sheba, because it wasn't a sign, but it's verse 11 or 12, it talks about Ophir, the place where there's lots of gold coming from, that Solomon is drawing gold from. So that may well be why our little town near Auburn here is called Ophir. Interesting connections. It happens all the time. Exactly. That happens all the time. So anyway, let's get any questions or comments from the online folks. Just didn't want to miss anybody. We'll get into some of this stuff. There's a lot to think about here, even though these are not well-known characters. So you may remember in the context of the life and the kingship of Solomon, I think it's the 3rd chapter, 1 Kings chapter 3, Solomon has that famous dream, and God says, I will gift you with anything you want. And what does Solomon famously ask for? He asks for a Porsche, exactly. So, I'm sorry, he asks for wisdom. So he gets wisdom. He's known to be this famously wise person, and that makes him really powerful. And in connection with that, it talks about how many people from all around, many kings and queens and leaders came to see Solomon because he was known to be so wise. And the Queen of Sheba, at least in the biblical context, is one of those people. And we don't know a lot about her in terms of what the Bible gives us. We know 2 things. A, she's fabulously wealthy. B, she's not afraid to share her opinions. So that's meaningful stuff. It's a start. Okay, it's a start. And as the Bible tells it, she hears about Solomon and goes up to inquire of him to find out, hey, are you as big a deal as everyone says you are? Are you as wise as everyone says you are? And she comes to an understanding about that. And there's this famous line at the end that has received much attention that basically says, meanwhile, King Solomon gave to the Queen of Sheba every desire that she expressed. What does that mean? Well, maybe we won't worry about specifics, but what it suggests is he is very much it's like, when you come to see a king, you often bring gifts, okay, to pay fealty to the king. His display of this for her suggests at least a level of respect, if not B, him feeling as if she is his superior. So at least equals, but he sees her very much as someone of prominence in the biblical story. Okay, but she comes to him of her own accord. There's not a lot more about her than that, except I found one more interesting thing about her in a book that most of us as Christians haven't really tapped into. It's the Quran. And in the Quran, there's a story about the meeting of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. And it's quite interesting. I printed it out. We're going to read it. But what's interesting about it is in that story, you have this bird. It's called the hoopoe bird. It's kind of like a bird of, just like a dream type bird, or it can fly and be your drone, sort of your reconnaissance thing. Anyway, he's talking to Solomon, this bird, telling him about this wonderful, fabulous queen who has been blessed. She has the throne blessed by Allah or God to have this. And in this story, it's Solomon who is very interested and said, well, send my men down there to find out about her fabulous wealth. And if she is who she says she is, tell her to come back and show fealty to me. Because because God has gifted her this throne. And so he says something like this. Now, there's a back and forth because the Queen of Sheba does not recognize that her power and her wealth come from God. That's part of the dynamic. And so the portion we'll read from the Quran doesn't go into all the back and forth, but the whole story is about Solomon going to her, and she's like, they're just doing this tit for tat about arguing about who's more prominent and powerful. And finally, Solomon convinces her that her power and her might are actually gifts from God. And once she accepts that, the story can move forward, and she goes back, and there's this kind of connection between the two that's similar to the Bible, but it's just different, a different angle to it. And there's a little bit more meat in the Quran as far as the Queen of Sheba. So we're going to use both of those, okay, to get into her. So that'll be fun. Now, Huldah. Huldah is such an interesting story because in the context of the book of Kings, what's really interesting is there are so few kings that are looked upon favorably. So many of them were just seen as abhorrent in the sight of the Lord. And so it's all these, like this pattern of the king sins, God punishes, Israel repents, God forgives. It's just this pattern over and over and over. But King Josiah, in this context, 2 Kings, is one of the few kings that was looked on favorably. And in the 18th year of his reign, he is cleaning out the temple and decides, we need to do something more significant. And so he goes to really redo the temple and really put some attention into it. In the process of this renovation, they come across a book of the law. Okay? This book of the law is, say, an old copy. Now, there's debate in scholarship whether or not that was something that was planted or that was just lost and found. One way or another, though, when he finds this book and has it read to him, he starts tearing his clothes. When someone tears their clothes, what is that a symbol of?
Mourning. Sorrow and
anguish, yes, and leading to repentance, certainly, but it's not positive. And so why is he doing this? Because he recognizes we haven't been doing this. And so then it's a move towards living into that. And Josiah is like, okay, how do we do this? Well, who does he go see? Do you know that two other famous prophets were serving in his court at this rough time? And that would have been Jeremiah and Zephaniah. He doesn't go to them. He goes to a woman who we have never heard of before this nor after, just as one story. And her name is Huldah. And she's a prophet, similar to Deborah, who was a leader and a prophet. But Huldah, they go to her, and she goes into this explanation that helps the king make a decision. But it's interesting as to what's the deal here, because it leaves open a question. Like, did he approach her because she would have some special insider knowledge? Was she connected with a different culture than, say, Jeremiah or Zephaniah? Hard to know. Is the story maybe trying to show us, like, wow, in a time when they never asked women for these kinds of opinions, he goes to her. This one is special. And we've seen that just when we thought that the biblical world never paid attention to women, we've seen Deborah, we've seen all these, but particularly recently, Deborah and now Huldah, who are given these real powers of discernment and gifts of prophecy and leadership. And they're asked, they're using them. So it's quite an interesting and important story. This is not just haphazard to be glossed over. This is something that one of the greatest kings in the history of Judah went to her for this important discernment. Now, it's very interesting that kings, much like the books of the law, were all written down in the time of the exile in Babylon. Okay, so all of these writings that we're talking about here, these kings and judges and that, these were all written down at a time of exile when Israel was particularly concerned that we got to keep track of our stories. Otherwise, we're going to be lost. So these stories about finding the law and living into the law again, they really work well in a situation of exile, where people are like calling to say, hey, look, just because we're living in a foreign land doesn't mean we need to lose our identity or that we should. God is calling us to stay true. Stories like this help them do that. So always read these stories, both in the sense of what the story itself is saying, but also try to think, oh yeah, if this was written in that particular time, how would the dynamics of exile be important for why this story was written? Sometimes that can be really opening. And don't for a second think that just because you didn't go to seminary or just because you're, lay people, you can't do this. You can do this. It's just a matter of taking that time and just reflecting on it. I'm not asking you to become experts in Hebrew, Israel, Greek history, all that. But this type of stuff is actually just go to Wikipedia, and you can find a little bit of history and you're like, oh, wow, there's a connection there to why these stories were written down when they were, or recovered when they were, and then how that informs the actual story itself. So we'll kind of let that lie there. I'm always trying to touch on that, but I'm inviting you once again to consider such things, okay, as we go through. So that's my background for these two characters. Any further questions or comments before we get into our reading?
Yeah.
Yes, Bonnie.
Can you explain about the prophets? And I mean, it makes me, how do they know that, she's not a fortune teller, which would be very different than a prophet from God?
A lot of times in the Bible, it's kind of curious because it sometimes feels arbitrary. Bonnie's question was, how do they know that this is actually a prophet or prophetess who is acting on behalf of God and not just some fortune teller who's informed by some other deity or something? Well, the story tries to do a good job of establishing the credentials of these prophets prior to them speaking or acting. So you can kind of tell that the story already looks at her favorably and sort of, bestows upon her this level of authority. She's one of the people of God. Okay, she's part of that. So that's the level of trust they're presenting. They don't really go into much of a story of hers, like, say, Samuel or some of the great prophets that have these birth stories that really establish this credential, this credibility. But the story sort of names it, and it's enough. That's what we're intended to say. Okay, accept that she's a woman of God.
Were there only prophets in the Old Testament, or was John the Baptist considered a prophet?
Yeah, that's a great question. John the Baptist was in the model of a prophet, and he would have been seen perhaps as a prophet. Look, Jesus himself was a prophet. Okay, so prophets are not something that disappeared off the face, but they were certainly more prominent in the Old Testament because of the dynamics. You know, they were nomadic. They didn't, you know, they were talking about, they were moving from this, in this period, they were moving to a time of judges, to a time of kings. And remember, there was a lot of resistance to that, both on the part of God and on the part of many in leadership. So this was part of the move. The prophets were always sort of there as intermediaries, you know, because the kings tended to be the more military leaders, the prophets tended to be the spiritual leaders. And then, you know, you were seeing how they were kind of utilized. The story of Deborah illustrates one of those ways where they were just sort of working in conjunction with each other. And Israel is trying to figure out how that all plays out. And as the kings move on, and as it goes into a time of kings, you'll see a lot more of the leaders embodying some of those prophetic tendencies themselves sometimes. But the prophets were always there. I mean, most of the books of the writings, you know, that whole half of the Old Testament are prophetic writings. But these are great questions, you know, because it is hard sometimes to know. And the story itself doesn't give us a lot, but it tells us enough. So the story is scant on detail, but it tells us that Huldah is a woman of credibility, so we should trust her. That's basically where the story's, you know, lay, how it comes out. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Well, let's carry on with our reading. I'm going to ask someone online if they would to do the first reading, which would be, you know, I separated it out. Why don't we just do 1 Kings chapter 10 and just go verses 1 to 13. I know it's probably going to have a few more difficult names, but that's okay. Folks in the class, it's going to be someone online that can speak this. But if there's someone who's willing to do that reading, 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 to 13. Online. So one of you 5. And I can't tell if Cecily's got her hand up because she doesn't have the camera.
Oh.
Okay, Marilyn's got her hand up. So thank you, Marilyn. 1 Kings 10, verses 1 to 13. Let's get you. Yeah, she's on you.
Would you remind me again where I start and where I stop?
Yeah, 1 Kings chapter 10, and then just go verses 1 to 13.
Okay. When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relation to the name of the Lord, she came to test him with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold and precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom of Solomon and the palace he had built, the food on his table, the seating of his officials, the attendant servants in their robes, his cupbearers, and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. She said to the king, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true, but I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth, you have far exceeded the report I heard. How happy your men must be. How happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness." And she gave the king 120 talents of gold, large quantities of spices, and precious stones. Never again were so many spices brought in as those the Queen of Sheba gave to King Solomon. Hiram's ships brought gold from Ophir, and from there they brought great cargoes of amberwood and precious stones. The king used the amberwood to make the supports for the temple of the Lord and for the royal palace, and to make harps, and lyres for the musicians. So much emerald wood has never been imported or seen since that day. King Solomon gave the Queen of Sheba all she desired and asked for, besides what he had given her out of his royal bounty. Then she left and returned with her retinue to her own country.
Thank you. A lot of words, but we get a picture of just overwhelming, ornate gifts of all kinds and every flavor that you can think of. So it is really just this kind of mutual love fest, but she really is the one that approaches him and gives him the gifts in this instance.
And somehow reading this out loud brings the abundance home even more to me than it did reading it silently.
It's so true. That's the way these stories often work, is to hear them out loud. It's just to almost be, it kind of overwhelmed by sometimes it's the repetitiveness of it all, but also just to hear and feel the details like that. It really opens it up. Thank you. So now, having that on one hand, I want to have someone in the class read this brief text from the Quran. It's from a book called Surah, chapter 27, verses 23 to 33. And once again, remember that the one talking at the initial part is this bird called the hoopoe bird, and it's talking to Solomon about this trip that it took over the land of the Queen of Sheba. Okay, so whoever reads it, just start with the word behold. And Perry, thank you.
Surah, chapter 27, verses 23 to 33. In the following story, King Solomon is being told by his hoopoe bird about what he has found on his trip. The hoopoe is informing King Solomon that he has knowledge that King Solomon does not. So now it starts. Behold, I found there a woman ruling over them, one who has been endowed with all things and has a mighty throne. I found that she and her people prostrate themselves before the sun rather than Allah. Satan has made their deeds appear attractive to them and has thus debarred them from the path of God so that they cannot find the right way. For they have come to believe that they ought not to adore God, although it is He who brings forth all that is hidden in the heavens and on earth, and knows all that you would conceal and all that you might reveal. God, save whom there is no deity, is the Lord of the mighty throne. Solomon said, soon shall we see whether you have spoken the truth or one of those that lie. Take this letter of mine, deliver it to them, and then draw back from them and observe what they do. When the queen had read Solomon's letter, she said, know, my nobles, that a gracious letter has been delivered to me. It is from Solomon, and it is in the name of God, the most gracious, the dispenser of grace. Exalt not yourselves before me, but come unto me in willing surrender. The queen added, nobles, let me have your counsel in this matter, for I make no firm decision about you. And they said, we are endowed with power and with mighty prowess in war, but the decision is yours. Therefore, consider what you would like to come in. That's it.
Okay. So that will be posted with the notes in case you didn't get to hear all of it. But essentially, what was just shared there was you got this bird telling Solomon, hey, she's got this woman's been blessed with the seed of power by God, but she doesn't realize it. She thinks it's, the sun, or she thinks it's, something else other than God. And so Solomon says, all right, well, let's do a test and let's try to see what she's all about and see if she's for real. And so Solomon sends the bird with a note to give to the Queen of Sheba. And that's when it begins this back and forth. The bird keeps going back and forth. And Solomon eventually does convince the Queen of Sheba that her power has not been given her by her own efforts or by the efforts of the deities that she thinks it's God. And she comes to this acceptance of that. And then in the story, she goes up and meets Solomon. And again, it's similar in the end, how the Bible one comes out. So that's kind of the rough summary of these two. And what it comes down to is there's not a lot that we can draw historically from this. These characters are difficult to pin down, but what we can glean about them, what we learn about them is what does faith look like And how do they move in the world according to the titles and the gifts that they've been given? And some of them move with, kind of openness and humility to God. Others move with resistance and this sense of it's all about me. Okay. So in that sense, in your own lives, in the way you have moved through your lives, and this is an honest answer here as best you can, not what you wish you had done. Because this is for all of us, right? But in the way you've lived your life, does anyone possess a better plan for you than God? And if so, how has that plan that you found yourself following, how has it stood up or compared to what the calling of God has been? Now, to say that is to recognize that sometimes we go through life and we have this sense of calling or understanding or this sense of spiritual guidance or call it God that we don't always listen to, but that we're aware of. And sometimes then we make choices according to other voices. So I ask you, in your lives, how has that played out? What voices, what plan have you tended to follow? And how has it stood up to that voice or that calling or that plan that God has expressed toward you? Isn't that a fun question? That's sort of what the dynamic is about the back and forth between Solomon and Sheba, or Queen of Sheba. Coming to terms with that. Marcia.
All right, I have confusion with plan.
Well, that's why I said it in a variety of ways. Some
Okay.
people identify with that word, but call it the nudgings, call it the calling of God, a sense of calling of God in your life. But yeah, not like plan, but again, some people identify with that word, but not necessarily like, here it is, all laid out for you. All you have to do is just start here and just follow them. That's not typically how life works.
So your question is, what have you done when you feel the nudge of God to do this?
No, my question is, how have you tended to really live your life? We all know that God has a call in us. We talk about it in church all the time. But really, when you either, that has been like the guiding for you, or have you found yourself, no, I'm going to follow a different plan. How has it stood up? What's been your experience of that? Has there been tension? Have you made it work? Or have you found that there are times in your life when that works, and then there's times when it just doesn't? And it's sort of an acknowledgement that we don't always follow. We're not always listening to that sort of voice. Call it conscience, call it God, call it a plan, call it a nudge, call it a calling, something. We're often aware of God's presence in our life, but not listening or not giving ourselves to it. So I'm asking, how has that worked out for people? Carol?
Well, that is exactly what happened to me when my company moved and I could no longer take a train or a bus to get to work. I had to drive 2.5 hours in bumper to bumper Southern California traffic. And I kept saying, I can make this work. I can make this work. I can make this work. Every day I told myself, I can do this. I can commute 5 hours a day, work 5, and then come home and at 8 o'clock, go back online and finish up what I didn't do at work.
Right.
And I was convinced I could do this. And Jay was retired and said, maybe we ought to consider this. And I can make this work because, if I retire early, you had to retire early financially. I just am not sure we can make this work.
Right.
And one day I came home and said, I can't make this work. And I retired early and we decided to move up here. And as soon as I let go of that and said, God, I don't know how we're going to do this, but it's been beautiful.
Yeah.
And I keep thinking, why did I fight so hard to make something that was intenable? And he kept saying, you can't do this. And I said, yes, I can.
You don't have to call me God.
Yeah, I heard that. I heard Jay next in the role of Solomon. But I particularly personally relate to that example, and I wonder if any of us, others of us resonate with it too. That sometimes we follow a path and a plan in our lives, and it doesn't shift or change until breakdown happens, until something that brings us to our knees. That's when, for one reason or another, we often allow God to sink in. That's when God finds us. So breakdown moments are those times of tension and shift. And a lot of us go through different portions of our lives. See, in my own experience, the breakdowns will lead to a trust in God often, and it lasts for a while. And then I'll start feeling good about myself again. And I'll go off on my own again. And I'll start thinking and acting as if it's all about me. That's an internal dynamic. And then there's these things that pull me back, often breakdown. Thank you. Anyone else? This isn't about pointing fingers. Again, this is not about judgment, but it's about recognizing what's been working for us and how have we really been living. To have our eyes open to that, I think is a real positive step in the walk of faith, because we recognize that this is something that we all go through. And again, it's not about, oh, you're going to be condemned. No, it's more about, okay, you're going to be awakened. And maybe we have a chance to really let it stick. And say, yeah, I know that my life isn't functioning the way I long for, the way I hope, the way that's life-giving when I do it this way. That's part of wisdom too, isn't it? We often, I think one of our stories is as young people, we feel invincible. We feel like it is all about us. We feel independent. And some of that is just how we kind of learn to differentiate from our families of origin and go out into the world. I think there's a time that that's necessary. But I also see and know that that independence then is met by tension and often breakdown or something that then moves us back to something that's a little bit more balanced. Okay. Anyone else? Barbara?
I lost my first husband when I was 25 years old. He was killed in an automobile accident. And so I placed myself on God. And everything turned out beautifully. I had some friends in California that introduced me to another man about 2 years later. And we married, and we were married for 40 years.
Yeah. Wow.
So when you give your life to God, He makes a way for you.
That's a beautiful example, Barbara, and I'm so thankful for that.
Yeah.
And again, a situation of trauma or catastrophic change was followed by, for her, a humbling and opening, a move toward sort of letting God in. As a pastor and as a human, I have seen people make other choices, and not that it's bad, but that it's in a situation like that, I've seen people move from one relationship to the next, to the next, to the next, because they're searching for an identity that's in that other person when they feel desperate because their life just shifted so dramatically. I relate to that. I'm sensitive. I'm compassionate for that. But I've seen that when it's located, it seems that when it's located, when my happiness and wholeness is located in another person, it is often difficult to sustain and maintain and truly find it. Whereas in situations of crisis, if we give over to God, it seems that there's just a broadness of possibility often, and a real healing that can happen within us. This isn't black and white, but that's a sense that I have over time in speaking with people who move through all these different things. So once again, we have a time of crisis that leads us to a time of humility, a time of opening. And the choice that Barbara made was to let God in, to let God guide in that sense. And that led you down, it led you through places that maybe you didn't see a way through. Thank you. Anyone else? Marilyn?
Yes. Oh, okay. I'm not muted.
Yeah.
My way of living my life for a lot of my life has been a little different from that, although I think that it's the same underlying truth. I haven't ever sort of given my life to God, specifically.
Mhm.
But as I look back, that really is exactly the way I've lived my life, a good part of my life. So it shows up the most clearly when I was living in the Bay Area, and a job became open for me in Maryland, across the country. And I really wanted to go and have practice in seeking a job and giving my job talk and all of that, but I didn't want to move. And boy, my parents sure didn't want me to. They lived at that time in Woodland. I was in the Bay area, they were in Woodland. And my mother really was dying of cancer. And they just didn't want me to go and be so far away. And I had such a strong feeling that it was the right thing to do, and that I would keep in close touch with my mother. I would come back and visit her as often as I could, so that we would be close. But this job in Maryland, when I went to try out for it, as I was flying across the country, I was thinking, I'm not going to want to move across the country, but this would be a good experience. And practically the second I stepped into the area in Maryland where I would be living, I could just see myself there. And that's always meant a lot to me, to sort of have some signs that the direction I'm going is the right one. And I kept praying about it. And I see these signs as sort of God's answer to my prayers. And as I flew back across the country, I thought, I can't believe I'm thinking this, but if they offer me that job, I'll take it. They did, and I did. And I found out later that I was their first choice, and they were so excited when I said yes.
Wow, great.
And I was there for 13 years, and it was just lovely. But still so hard on my parents. And I did do my very best to keep in contact with my mother. She died shortly after I moved. And then my father came to visit me, and I took him all around Washington, D.C., and he just had a great time. And more and more and more, he began to see that I was in the right place.
Yeah.
I was having a good effect on my students and on the other faculty, and it was just the right thing for me to do. So anyway, it seems to me that kind of applies, even though not in quite the same way we were thinking about it.
No, but it does, because to me, there's no guarantees. We're not assured that when we are operating with God, that it's going to lead us to the place that is, what we think is the right place, because often we learn and grow through controversy, through difficulty, through all the things. But what you did is you poised yourself to be the best receptor to the spiritual water of God. So if you're a sponge, your prayerful way, your thoughtful approach, your humble approach to this allowed you to wet the sponge so that it would receive the water when it got there. Everyone knows you can't clean up anything with a dry sponge. So it's only when it's wet that it actually can make something else.
What a visual.
Good analogy.
But and that's powerful. It reminded me of when we moved out here. And it was such a prayerful, hard thing, because we were leaving our families. And I remember talking to my parents about it. And my mom basically just said, I will feel, yes, we will miss you. We won't see you as much, but I will feel so good knowing that you're going to a place where you're going to raise a beautiful family and where you will be so happy and you will create happiness. And that's the best thing. So I trust that. And when she said that, she kind of gave us permission to trust our hearts to take a leap. And it's been hard at times, for sure. They both my parents the same week were diagnosed with cancer, about 1 year after we moved out here. And at that time, we were just like, oh my gosh, what are we doing? So far away. But it worked out, and I was able to go back. And this church has always been so supportive. And the point is, you take leaps at times in your life, and you try to do it. Or maybe, what I've learned, and what a lot of us, I think, learn, is you try to do that in a balanced way, and then trust that the outcome, as long as you keep inviting God in, a path will be made. It may not be so-called perfect, but it's that practice of learning to be in connection with the fact that my life and my goals are not mine alone. If we can stay true to that, if we can understand that, if we can keep inviting God in, if we just stay connected to God, it seems that things open up for us. Again, no guarantees, but it just opens it.
I also see grace in your parents and in Marilyn's dad and mom too.
Yes.
And the lesson for all of us too is that when we see these changes, we need to have grace.
And that's a hard one, isn't it? Yeah, Kathleen's naming that. Sometimes, it really, you can be a help. You can be a God-like nudge to the people when you see they're about to leap into their lives. The loving thing to do sometimes and often is to let them go. And even when we want to hold on. I mean, I can't even imagine right now. Wyatt is 10, 8 years is what we have with him. And then college. And then it just changes, right? It's not over, but it just changes. So that thought, I want to hold on to him like this, but it's something you have to learn as you go. And I think that's sort of what these stories invite us to stay in touch with. What have we really been giving ourselves to? And do we trust it? Do we really trust this so-called voice of God? Do we trust the callings of God? That's the day-to-day invitation, right? I find my trust goes like this. It's always kind of depends on how I'm feeling in a given day. I don't know if you all relate to that, but I got some nods in this room. And it's just, that's just the way it is. So I find it when I'm at my best, I trust God like crazy. When things start falling apart, sometimes I trust God. It depends on what it is, though. Sometimes I freak out, stress out, don't sleep, and look for ways that I got to dig out of this.
Yeah.
That's human nature.
I believe help down my unbelief.
Yes, exactly. I believe help down my unbelief. And I have a role to play in this, but it's about staying balanced and saying, I do have to do something, but don't lose the overall picture that I'm not doing it alone. I saw Jane first and then Marcia.
Well, returning to our story of the Queen of Sheba and learning a little more about her, that she had it all, but she didn't have God.
Yes.
She had, and it was that she saw something and heard enough about Solomon that she wanted to find out more about him and his wisdom. And it was being in his presence maybe and his wisdom and seeing, and she recognized that God had bestowed that on him, at least when the scripture says that she says, praise the Lord your God.
Yes.
The God, your God, the Lord has constant love for Israel. She was saying.
She recognizes it.
Yeah,
She
and
gets
so
it in the end.
where, to me, it just speaks to where do I need to remain open-hearted and willing and responsive when God is trying to speak to me through somebody else or something else or
Right.
hear scripture.
And how much do we locate our power, our happiness, our joy in this world, our effectiveness in this world? How much do we locate all those so-called good things in our material wealth or in what we have, that kind of thing? She had it all. And yet she didn't have God, and she recognized that there was a hole, that it wasn't, she didn't feel complete. Okay, I'm not going to psychologize her because we don't have that information, but I think we can relate to the fact that in our own lives, there's a time when you realize, okay, all these things, they're not bad. It's kind of nice, okay, but kind of nice doesn't feel ultimate. And a lot of us come to this place, again, sometimes it's breakdown, or sometimes it's just recognition that that stuff is really empty and or at least neutral. And so I want something deeper. I want something more. And that's when we find ourselves opening to that more and God. So that's the movement that a lot of us face. And to be able to see it clearly and as honestly as possible is to help. It's like a spiritual machete on the path to help clear it, to help us walk a little more easily and gracefully through this life is what it comes down to. All right, well, thank you. Any other questions or comments about? Did we get to Marcia? Yeah, Marcia's comment. Yeah.
I'm kind of the opposite, that when I'm skating and every part of my life is just wonderful, my ears are not big. I'm like, everything's great.
Yes, yeah.
But as soon as something starts to break down, it's like, oh God, you know, and so it's a little critical, I guess. It's like I should be ears open all the time.
Well, listen, it's a little, okay, call it a little hypocritical. If it's hypocritical, we're all hypocrites. It's a lot human, as Perry said, it's human nature. And, you know, we often read the biblical texts as if they are wagging this godlike finger out of the sky, waiting to smite us. When in truth, these stories are designed to give us hope and encouragement that even in these situations and all these people, you know, David fell all over himself, Solomon, the greatest, fall all over themselves, okay? That's not the point. The point is, here's how to move through this and to say, let the past go. This is what grace and forgiveness are all about, and move forward into something greater. These characters discover it, we're invited to do the same. And yeah, I relate to that. I think a lot of us do. When life's good, we often don't bother going to God very much. That's where the whole foxhole faith came from. Everyone has religion when you're in a foxhole, when your life is threatened, when things are falling apart. Yeah, I shouldn't say everyone, but that's when many of us go to a higher power. It's not in the times of prosperity, but it would behoove us to stay open to the movements and even just the spirit of gratitude, which we started talking about last week in church. Practicing gratitude is a way to invite God in, maybe in times of prosperity or when things are good. Remembering to be thankful. Okay? These are just all little ways to open up this text. But her story, the Queen of Sheba, was one that kind of moved through this dynamic that we're talking about. Okay? So thank you. Mary.
So I just read chapter 14. And stunning. Says the weight of gold that Solomon received yearly, 666 talents. My footnote says that that's 25 tons. So I just figured out that's 880,000 ounces rather. That's $1,600 an ounce. Yearly. So substantial treasure.
Yes.
So you see why he was so.
Well, and it's interesting.
You know,
Okay, so Perry's sort of looking at some of this and saying, wow, what does this really translate to in modern terms, in terms of Solomon's wealth? I can assure you this, Solomon was wealthy. And I can also assure you that these stories in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles intentionally embellished that wealth. They wanted to make sure that the reader understood that in this time of Solomon, this was a blessed kingdom. This was the best of times, so to speak. And yet, what we also know is that it was because of Solomon, because of some of the practices that happened under Solomon, that things started to fall apart. So it's a really interesting dynamic. Where we are right now, everything seems to be hunky-dory for Solomon, but it's not too much in the future that we start to realize things are not as good as they look now. And that's what happens. And it's not to say, oh, Solomon, throw him out. He was horrible. He had all these wives, concubines, he had slaves. Yes, all that's true. David was just as bad in terms of his behavior. But we are not judged solely on this particular discrete act. This is the problem of modern Christianity in many ways. We think we are, or we act like we are. When we make a mistake, when we commit a sin, we act like, oh, we're bad. I'm ashamed. I have no right to step in church again until I get myself together. Whatever it is that we tell ourselves, we act like we are when we make a mistake that we should be tossed out into Gehenna, the fire pit, and just thrown out with the trash. That's unfortunate because these stories are really nearly never about that. But that's part of the life of faith too, is learning how to walk with grace. And a lot of the grace we learn applies to ourselves. It has to apply to ourselves first. We can't be graceful with someone else until we learn to receive it in ourselves. So these stories that talk about all the opulence and the affluence, yes, wow, how powerful the kingdom of Israel was, but nothing lasts forever. And dynamics change, relationships change, faith changes, practices change, and then God moves in through that too.
you know, this is really speaking to me about how probably 10 years ago, we might not have
been thinking the way we are now about the world situation.
Yeah.
We probably were all thinking, life is good. You know, we all were wearing those life is good t-shirts, you know, and everything was fine with our portfolio investments and everything was good. The world has changed so much in the last, 4 or 5 years, that what do we really have but to look for wisdom and look for God? We know that our affluence is not going to cut it anymore. It's not going to cut it how we treat other human beings. It's not going to cut it how we treat the world. It's just like, it's the wisdom. It's what God can bring, the grace. It's I just think we're in such a different place.
It's the wisdom of not judging our lives by our current circumstances. Be our current circumstances times of opulence and wealth and everything's going well, or be they the difficult times. We are asked with wisdom to live lives like, well, I'm going to pick up one of the examples from the US and the Holocaust documentary I just watched, where Anne Frank and her diary are mentioned. And we've all, I believe most of us have read it. I would say everyone should read it again. It's incredible. And this little young woman, with her insights on humanity, but one of the things that she said was, despite everything I've seen, everything that's happened, I still believe that in general, people are essentially good. She trusted that until her end. And it is so powerful. And it's like, that's the choice that we can remain, connected to. That whatever's happening, see, we tend to go like, oh, when everything's good, I'm good. And it's okay, we are good, but just don't stay stuck. Don't let yourself get trapped in this little eddy of this little bubble, because that bubble will get popped. And then what happens? We pray that we have the spirit of an Anne Frank that can stay, connected to the bigger perspective, the bigger picture when things fall apart. But it's something that's cultivated and practicing. Good conversation, everyone. Let's move into Huldah. I recognize that some need to leave at 10. We've got a few minutes to get started. We'll do this, and I appreciate if those need to drop off because of timing, but I think we'll be able to cover this. Probably finish up by 1/4 latest. So let's look at Huldah. We're talking 2 Kings chapter 22, verses 8 to 20. And could we have someone from the room here read that? 2 Kings 22, verses 8 to 20. This is the story of Huldah. And it's got some good names. Don't worry about the names. You go right through those names, okay? I don't want you tripping up. You pronounce them like you just wrote them yourself. Okay? Marcia's going to go for it.
Then Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan, the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan to read it. Am I saying Shaphan right?
That's fine. Don't hesitate. Keep going.
Shaphan the scribe came to the king and brought back word to the king and said, your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house and have delivered it into the hand of the workmen who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. Moreover, Shaphan the scribe told the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read it in the presence of the king. And it came about when the king heard the words of the book of the law that he tore his clothes. Then the king commanded Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, the son of Shaphan, Achbor, the son of Micaiah, Shaphan the scribe, and Asaiah the king's servant, saying, go, inquire of the Lord for me and the people and all Judah concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that burns against us, because of our fathers have not listened to the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us. So Hilkiah the priest, Ahikam, Achbor, Shaphan, and Asaiah went to Huldah, the prophetess, the wife of Shalom, the son of Tikvah, the son of Harhas, keeper of the wardrobe. Now, she lived in Jerusalem in the second quarter, and they spoke to her. And she said to them, thus says the Lord God of Israel, tell the man who sent you to me. Thus says the Lord, behold, I bring evil on this place and on its inhabitants, even all the words of the book which the king of Judah has read, because they have forsaken me and have burned incense to other gods, and that they might provoke me to anger with all the work of their hands. Therefore, my wrath burns against this place, and it shall not be quenched. But to the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, thus shall you say to him, thus says the Lord God of Israel, regarding the words which you have heard, because your heart was tender, and you humbled yourself before the Lord when you heard what I spoke against this place and against its inhabitants, that they should become a desolation and a curse. And you have torn your clothes and wept before me. I truly have heard you, declares the Lord. Therefore, behold, I will gather you to your fathers, and you shall be gathered to your grave in peace. Neither shall your eyes see all the evil which I will bring on this place. So they brought back word to the king.
Well done. Nice job.
Thank you.
So many good names in there. And all that's doing is that it's lists of credibility, you know, that this is important. And this is when you see all those ancestry things, a lot of times it doesn't make a lot of sense to us, but to say that is to be able, it enhances credibility within the context of the story. So, you know, essentially what we've been given is Huldah is the prophetess that describes Israel's sort of later understanding of why it was they ended up going into exile. Okay? The self-understanding of Israel when they were in exile is that we screwed up. We stopped worshiping God in the right ways. And because we gave ourselves to other pursuits, other deities, things fell apart. That's the self-understanding of Israel as to why they went into exile. Now, Babylon may have a different story because from a political vantage point, they were the military might of the time. And much like Poland during World War II, the Nazis just rolled in and took what they had because they wanted, because they had the power, they had the military might. Babylon was very similar. Not the same intentions. Babylon's intention was to go in, take the best people out and bring them back for their cosmopolitan city. You know, they wanted, you know, just to have the best of the best. Leave all the farmers and the people of the land to fend for themselves, but they're still vassals to us. They can still produce stuff and pay. So they had a little different intention. But this passage of Huldah is so important. She is the name, the voice that is telling basically Israel that this is what's going to happen. You're kindling God's wrath by not following the law, by not honoring God in the right ways. But as I said, it's very interesting, you know, because this is the time of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was warning about the same things. And they go to Huldah instead of Jeremiah. Not necessarily, who knows what that means? Maybe this going to her was a way to say, this is so unique and important that we're giving this to a woman prophetess. Again, it's not the only time, but it stands out. Why is the story doing this? You know, it doesn't describe it. It doesn't tell us. But because we don't know anything about Huldah after that. But we know she's prominent, and we know, if we keep reading, that what she says comes to pass. So she's got authority. She's got credibility. Thank you to you both. So tell me this. You know, when Hilkiah and when Josiah go to Huldah versus, you know, Jeremiah, you know, they could have made another choice, I suppose, but are there certain situations that you can think of where it might be better for a man or a woman to kind of interpret or teach a certain biblical text or a certain interpretation that's of scriptural or spiritual importance, can you think of a time when it might be better to have a man or a woman do a certain type of prophetic interpretation like that?
Well, depending on their background, if that's their area of expertise, I suppose.
Well, even in modern context, do you sense there are certain times and places where you either could see or even wish that there was a certain a man or a woman in a position to do a special interpretation? And maybe we can broaden it from scripture, maybe just something of significance that you think, wow, if there had been a man doing that, or if there had been a woman doing that, it really would have been helped. Can you think of examples like that?
Well, like if you ask the Dalai Lama, it's like getting answers from that person. Because there would be less filters maybe through that answer. There would be something more direct.
And the Dalai Lama always is a man,
Yeah.
correct? So so perhaps,
Yeah. Something that could be a man or a woman.
yeah, well, are there times where you found yourself wishing or wondering or, that a woman involved with this decision or interpretation would have been a much different outcome as to a man. And sometimes, or a man doing it would have either helped or hurt it in some sort of way. Are you just aware of certain places where having a woman or a man might have made a big difference?
Well, I think today, if there was a woman running Iran, it might be a very different place.
There's a great example.
Or the United States.
There's a great example. So yes, Jay brought up the idea of what if a woman was running Iran? It really would mean that's a complete shift in their way of governing and approach to being in the world. That's a great example. Marsha brought up the idea of in the United States, having a woman president would be a real shift. Now, I'm not sort of speculating, well, because women are warmer or more compassionate. No. I'm not speculating on exactly how it would have been different. Just there's no question that having a woman in that place of leadership would make a difference. Would make some sort of difference. One of the reasons is because it's never been done before. That's one of the reasons. But this is what it is. In some ways, there's a lot of times and places in our lives, sometimes it could be on a smaller level, like say when we're a kid and we're talking about, maybe sexuality or certain things. It's more comfortable to talk to a man or a woman, depending on who we are and that sort of thing. So that's some of the individual smaller levels. But I think there is an awareness that sometimes it can be really valuable and meaningful and different to have a female voice in a position of power or a male voice. And all I'm asking when I say that question is, there are so many times where we have assumptions about who the authority is. I can't tell you how many churches, when I interviewed at like 15 different churches before I came here, there were so many of them that said, yeah, we want to hire a straight white male minister because that is who we see as the authority. We have a hard time in our church. And a lot of times they said, because we tried having a woman minister and it just didn't work. So they were very honest, but I was like, I don't really want to be a part of that. And not because it's bad, I want to be part of a community that's at least open to ideas and not sort of setting themselves off like that just because they had a particular experience. So that sort of thing I've interacted with, I've come in contact with. It can change, depending on what we're open to. And so sometimes a question like that just invites us to say, okay, wait a second, what are the assumptions that I hold? What is it that I sort of value in terms of who's in authority about something? Is it the Dalai Lama types? Again, wonderful person, very wise. But do we often locate the authority that we grant in someone who is a man? Do we find ourselves allowing or giving ourselves more? Are we more inclined to find wise women, to rely on women in positions of leadership and power? This is good, powerful, meaningful reflection to do this. So we check what our assumptions are. Bonnie, did you?
I just wondered if you watched 60 Minutes Sunday night
No.
with the head of the Southern Baptist Convention being
No.
interviewed by Anderson Cooper.
Wow.
That was Yes, a different perspective.
Quite eye-opening.
Yeah, I mean, he's talking to Anderson Cooper, who everybody knows is
Mhm.
gay, and he's saying, you know, would you accept a gay person into your, you know, could they be in your church? And oh no, I'm like, you're gay too,
Yeah,
but you know, and you know, it went on from there, but
I would like to see that. Yeah.
yeah, if you can go back to that segment Sunday night, when Anderson Cooper I don't know the guy's name, but he's now apparently the head of the Southern Baptist Convention. It was, wow, we got a long way to go.
And well, they're doubling down on their experience and their
Oh, yeah.
tradition, what they see
Oh, yeah.
biblically, what they have chosen to see biblically.
He doubled down.
And that's what it is. See, what we're learning is there have been, and throughout the scriptures, there are women in positions of leadership and power and discipleship and like priests, like prophets and that sort of thing. So this is not new. And so the churches that have chosen to do it this narrow way and exclude women, I think are really doing so at their own, you know, at a cost to their own sort of wholeness and the possibility of God moving. So, but that took a long time for this denomination to do that. It wasn't until the 80s that we started getting women in our churches. Yes, we all know, or if you know your UCC history, Antoinette Brown was ordained back in like 1853, but that's a one-off. And very few, and most up until 70s and 80s, you know, that women finally became more, and now in our denomination, there are more women ministers than men. Yeah. Yeah. So it's just but it takes time to go through this, but it's important to check ourselves to see it. Yes.
It was, go ahead. It was difficult for my mother to accept a woman.
Yes.
And she's a very God-fearing and beautiful woman and lived many, many, many years. But she couldn't hear her voice as well. And that was one of the things. She came around, but
Yeah, and sometimes it's little details like that. It's the way projection, the way someone conveys the message and you know, has a spirit of authority, a presence of authority, whatever it is. Women face a much more steep hill to climb when it comes to positions of leadership, certainly within ministry, and we've seen and known in other fields as well. So again, the question has to do with, you know, what is it that to start to tap into what defines for me what an authority figure looks like and should sound like and be, you know, and are there places that I've kind of sealed off one or the other? It's not just women, sometimes it's men. Okay, and it's just, and a lot of it has to do with experience. When we have a negative experience, it leads to some dismissal or just some hesitancy to kind of go there with somebody.
We have no experience. You know,
Or have no
no
experience.
experience. This must be bad, but you've never had
Yeah,
it.
we've never done it that way before, so
Yeah,
let's not, you know, upset the apple cart. Yeah, that's how a lot of us function, not just churches. We know that's a way, or at least the stereotype about churches function. But in our lives, that's how we often function. Haven't done it that way before. Let's not try it now. You know. So when is it for you? When is it appropriate to allow the culture we live in to affect how we live out our Christian walk? When is it appropriate to let the culture decide with us? And when isn't it? Yeah.
I was thinking recently when Christiane Amanpour refused to put on the hijab.
Yes.
And I have seen her wear that before when she's been over in the Middle East. But because of what has happened recently, because the
Excellent.
murder of this young woman,
Mhm.
because of they didn't think she was dressed appropriately, and essentially they killed her. That's when you say, or that's when Christiane said, you know, no, I'm not going
It's a
there.
great example. So for much of Christiane Amanpour's, you know, reporting life, she goes to a Muslim country. She's more than happy to be respectful, to abide by the cultural norms, to wear the hijab. Okay, and in this instance that Bonnie's bringing up recently with you know all the different protests that have been going on now for weeks or even months almost in Iran, with the death of that young girl who was perceived to just have something loose on her face
Her hair.
her hijab. And yeah, and then she was killed in custody. And now it's all these protests. And in relation to that, Christiane Amanpour then refused to wear the hijab when she was sought to be interviewed by someone within Iran. Now they canceled the interview because of that, but it was an act of principle for her. So that's a really good example. Sometimes culture can lead us down, and it's okay. We step into it and we do so with grace, that we sort of welcome in certain customs and practices. But a lot of times sometimes we don't. Do you remember when President Obama went to Japan, and I think it was his first term, and how much flack he got when he bowed to the Japanese prime minister? Okay, he was being respectful of their custom and their culture, not sort of showing fealty to the emperor, but showing respect to this co-leader in the world. But the flack that he got is that it made America look submissive or weak. Yeah. And so this is some of the tension. And so all of these moments, when we say, oh, yes, well, this for me is what it means when I practice this in a given culture or a given moment. But for another person, it might have a completely different value. And so how do we decide? What is it? When is it okay for culture to help us move along the path of our lives and toward God? And when isn't it? How do we discern this? Because that's the discernment that they, in this time of Josiah, were trying to figure out too. Their culture and their practices were not in alignment with those of God. And how do you manage that tension? And that's what all of us get to do. That's the struggle of faith. And just to remind us once again, Israel means one who struggles with God, or they who struggle with God. So we're in good company. From the beginning. Any other thoughts about that? We're always at not at the whim, but we live in culture, and we're asked to be in the world, but not of it. What does that mean to you? And we're asked to be in the world, but not of it. How does that affect then how we are to live? Marcia?
Sometimes when I'm day-to-day living and things can get tense, I lift myself, and my son calls it 50,000 feet above, and look down at the situation. And it minimizes it a bit. It's like, okay, it's not the end of the world. It's not the beginning of the world. It's just things that happen. And it's going to be okay. And you're not alone.
Right.
So that
it's a practice of remembering that we're not just ants. And that our reality is not just the microcosm of what is happening right now, but there's a part of us that has wings. And so that we need not be slaves to the moment, but to take that step back, to try to have a sense of perspective, to not see, it's not to say that, well, be in the world, we're all in the world, but not of it. It's not to say, so don't do anything that your culture said. No, it's not that black and white. But to be of the world means that we are sort of slaves to the ways of the world. We find that if we are slaves to anything, then our wholeness and our freedom are impacted. The folks during Josiah's time, the people during Josiah's time, were slaves to their practices that were not following the ways of God. And what we see is, at least in their self-conception, that led to disaster. Okay, it led to a breaking of life and of meaning and of connection to each other and to God. Okay, that was significant. So to be in the world but not of it is not to just say, oh, I'm only with God. No, it's to say I give myself to an attention to that there's something more than just what's happening right here and now. This microcosm, this ant-like perspective that a lot of us have. Now, that's not easy to do. I get it. Because when certain things happen in our lives, especially in our personal lives, it can be hard to find anything except a desperate longing for it to be different than what it is, or, stay really, really stuck in a small bubble. And that happens. What we're talking about is a practice, a general approach of how we cultivate an awareness that our lives are not just defined by circumstances or by ourselves. Okay? It's that awareness of something more than our individual circumstances, our families, our community, our culture. Yeah.
I think that our faith, our coming to church, our being in study, all the things for me help me to try to be that person that when I'm butting up against culture and with people that are starting to get negative about something, and even the comment I made, how the world is so different right now, I'm still called to be light. That's where I believe that I don't want to go to that base level of where the conversation is going. I can see it going. I want to be light. I want to make a comment like you mentioned, Anne Frank said, I still see goodness. I still see goodness. God is still working. God is still going to bring about goodness through us.
That's
through
it.
us.
And if God is working that way, then so are we.
Yeah.
And a lot of us make the mistake, or at times in our life, we've made the mistake, or we've been told that the definition of what it means to be a churchgoer or a Christian is once we give ourselves to God, maybe with some words, with some special prayers, then we have earned a ticket. And that ticket ensures where we're going to go when all this is over. And we hang on to that as if it's all that matters. And sometimes that leads to a kickback on the couch attitude about things going on in the world. When truly, what being a part of a church means, it's not about getting a ticket, it's about getting a pair of hiking shoes that can take you out to the difficult wilderness domain that is often required, where God already is, and where we're invited to go, and trust that we will go like the disciples. Take your shoes, take a walking stick, and take a little bit of food just to last for the day, and just go.
And let God work through you. I don't have to have an answer, but let him work through me.
Let that continue.
Yeah.
God working in the world is not separate from us. God is working often through us. Each of us has a part to play. And that's where the hiking shoes, I think, is a good analogy, because that's what the good Christian faith, that's what church is helping us to become. Yes. Oh, did you have your hand up? Did you want to?
No.
Oh, I thought I would use some wave. I think people were getting all evangelical. Voice.
Research tells us that we tend to take on the behaviors and thinking of the majority. And so if we, and we can look at our history, you look at some of the things that our country has done and our culture has done, how we treated and still treat the Indians, how we locked up Asians, especially Japanese. All those things would normally go against our values and our thinking, but the majority all of a sudden said, oh, we need to do this out of fear. And the rest of us probably stayed quiet and allowed it to happen, or even joined up and thought it was a good thing.
Yes.
And so it's really difficult. We do tend to take, I did some research several years. I was in a lockup facility, I was in a lockup facility, but I was able to walk out. And it was interesting. We did research how when in a prison, how people that work in a prison many times take on the attributes of prisoners. And so that's why you see some of these things happening where guards take prisoners out or fall in love with them, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very difficult when you're in a society or in a group of people who do things that aren't godly, to fight it, to stay away. And I think that what your question was, in the world and not whatever it was.
Fully defined by that, yes.
Yeah, it's difficult to stay away from what the majority are doing. Very difficult.
We have countless examples of that happening, and we also have countless examples of the people who have stood up, who have put their lives on the line to be that beacon of light, to be that voice in the wilderness that speaks that truth despite what everyone else is saying. And the only way that's possible is if it's cultivated. That's really what we've been getting at, to cultivate it, to look at what are the motivators, what really are your perspectives and attitudes, and then try to broaden them, try to welcome in a different spirit, because that will set you, each one of you, it'll set me up to be the best sponge, to be the best hiker, to be the best servant of God for the sake of the world's blessing, for the sake of God continuing to do God's work in the world. It's not about us kicking back and saying, you go, God, you're doing a great job. That's not it. That's not how it works. It's that partnership. It's a cultivation of that awareness that helps us live into the partnership. Friends, once again, thank you for a rich conversation. There's a lot more places that we could go, but I hope this has given you some good seeds and fodder for continued reflection over the week. And I look forward to continuing next week. The video and notes will be up on the church website as soon as I can get them up there, because of the nations that takes a couple of days. But God bless you until we meet again.
Thank you.